Hi, this is Dr. Perry Carpenter. I'd like to thank you for taking the time to join me on this week's video. In this week's video, we're in session number 4 of our new series entitled Cumulative Trauma and the QME. And in today's session, I want to continue to expand upon some of the issues and concepts that we've discussed in our first 3 sessions and provide for you some actual case examples that help illustrate the principles that we've discussed so far in this program. And these case examples are going to help you further realize the strategies and sequences of events that are operative behind the scenes in each of the evaluations that you receive, especially those that involve an allegation of cumulative trauma, and especially the subset of those cases wherein the case or the claim is filed after the employee has separated his or her relationship with the employer. So we're going to delve even deeper into the concept of the post-employment cumulative trauma claim. And before we get into the topics of today's discussion, let's just briefly review where we've come from so far in this program. In our first session, we defined and described what actually qualifies as an injury in the California workers' compensation system. And not every bump, bruise, scrape, or incident of painful activity that employees engage in qualify as actual injury in California workers' compensation. The definition of injury is quite specific. So your first task as a qualified medical evaluator, especially in those denied cases that come to us for an evaluation, especially on AOE, COE, your first obligation is to determine whether or not the examinee actually has an injury. If the examinee actually has what qualifies as an injury, then your next determination can become whether or not that injury is related to the workplace duties. In other words, does the examinee qualify, yes or no, for a workers' compensation claim, and does he or she qualify for benefits under the California workers' compensation system? So the first step in determining the presence or absence of an industrial injury is to establish the presence or absence of an actual injury, as that is defined in the California workers' compensation system. And we went into that discussion at great length. And that led us into our second session, where we established important principles related to the dates of injury for both claims of specific incidences of injury and also for claims of cumulative trauma types of injuries. And cumulative trauma types of injuries are due to repetitive, physically traumatic activities extending over a period of time. And because they extend over a period of time, they have a different definition as to the date of injury compared to the very clear-cut, cut and dry, black and white date of injury related to specific incidences of injury. We also talked about the importance of the reporting by the employee to the employer of the incident of injury. And the obligation for reporting industrial injury falls upon the injured person, falls upon the employee. And Labor Code 5400 and 5402 both describe what qualifies as a legitimate reporting of the injury. And Labor Code 5400 creates a strict set of criteria wherein the employee is required to submit in writing within 30 days of the incident of injury a written statement as to the occurrence of the injury. But then along comes Labor Code 5402, which greatly softens the requirement of a written notice from employee to employer, such that almost any description of reporting of the incident from the employee to the employer qualifies as a bona fide reporting of the incident of injury. And this is where a great many disputes and controversies arise, as one party contends that they reported the industrial injury and the other party, of course, negates that claim or contests that claim. So this is an area of great contention, and it's important for us as qualified medical evaluators to understand this, because in the face-to-face evaluation, injured workers will always tell us that they reported the injury, and they'll use various descriptors to explain and to illustrate as to how they reported the industrial injury. They'll say things like, I told my supervisor, or I went to human resources, or I filled out an incident report with my manager. And they will always get in the record, and they will always tell us as qualified medical evaluators that they reported the incident of injury, because reporting of the injury is their obligation, and it's their responsibility in terms of the claim for industrial injury becoming initiated. It becomes initiated by the employee, and so the injured worker employee will always back up their testimony by telling us that they indeed did fulfill their obligation and did fulfill their responsibility by properly reporting the claim. So that's an important concept for us as qualified medical evaluators to understand. And then in our last session, we transitioned into the fascinating topic of post-employment cumulative trauma injury claims. Now, these are claims for industrial injury, and specifically they're claims for cumulative trauma injury that are filed, meaning the claim is filed. The employee fills out a claim form in the hope of obtaining workers' compensation benefits after the separation from the employer. And there's two different types of separations of employee from employer. There are those separations of employee from employer that are initiated by the employer initiated separations, such as firing, such as layoff, such as reduction in work hours. Those are initiated by the employer. And then the employee initiated separations would include, for example, a sabbatical, a retirement, a quitting, a leave of absence. These are types of separations from employee and employer that are employee initiated. Now, the law deals with these separations differently, and Labor Code 3600 generally bans, bars, prohibits, blocks, prevents the filing of industrial injury claims after separation, when the separation is initiated by the employer. And the purpose of this law is to prevent employee retaliation against the employer. But if the employee initiates the separation him or herself, then all of these so-called post-termination defenses under Labor Code 3600 disappear and dissolve. So this opens wide the entire universe for employees who have quit, who have retired, who have taken a leave of absence, who have been off on a sabbatical. Opens wide the opportunity for that particular group of employees to file post-employment claims for both specific and cumulative trauma injuries. Now, when the separation is initiated by the employer, the law bars these claims. However, there are exceptions, and the purpose of the exceptions are to protect those workers who actually did suffer an industrial injury, but for whatever reason, and there's 1,000 reasons in the big city, for whatever reason, they did not file the claim until after their separation from the employer. In other words, there are legitimate cases of employees who have legitimately injured themselves at work, but did not have the wherewithal, did not have the presence of mind, did not have the opportunity, or whatever, to file the claim until after their separation, and the law protects them. And specifically, Labor Code 3600 Section 10 provides great opportunity for the filing of claims post-employment for the cumulative trauma injury species of claim, or the cumulative trauma injury species of injury. The exceptions to Labor Code 3600 open the door wide open for the filing of these claims, and these claims come to us for our opinion on AOE, COE, and other issues as well. So that was a fascinating discussion. In today's session, I want to share with you 3 actual cases that are going to help illustrate and solidify these principles. And the main message that I want to share with you today is that with regards to each of these concepts and each of these issues, disputes can arise in every one of these issues. Disputes can arise as to whether or not what the examinee is presenting with qualifies as an injury, as to whether or not the examinee is suffering disability, as to whether or not the examinee has a need for medical treatment. Disputes can arise over the dates of injury. Disputes can arise as to whether the injury is a specific injury or whether it's a cumulative injury. Disputes can arise as to whether or not the examinee properly reported the industrial injury as required by law. Disputes can arise in every one of these areas. And really, disputes can arise over each and every word. Each and every word that is used to define these various topics, and I'm going to illustrate that more in today's discussion. And I want to share with you how the courts resolve these various disputes in arriving at final opinions and conclusions that are accurate and that make sense and that qualify as substantial evidence in the context of all the facts of the case. So these case examples that I'm going to share with you today are going to facilitate your understanding and allow you to better wrap your mind around some of these difficult concepts. So with that as our introduction, let's get into today's discussion as we continue on the subtopic heading of post-employment cumulative trauma injury claims in our new series entitled Cumulative Trauma and the QME. So as we get into today's discussion and as we review these 3 actual case examples, it's going to be important for us to remember and to focus on 2 main concepts. The first has to do with Labor Code 3610D, and we discussed this at length in our last session. 3610D is the exception to the post-termination barring, banning, blocking, preventing of the filing of cumulative trauma injury claims filed post-employment after the employee has separated his relationship from the employer. And to paraphrase 3610D, 3610D tells us that claims filed post-employment for an allegation of cumulative trauma injury can become accepted claims when the date of injury is after the notice of termination or layoff. And the date of injury is defined very specifically in another labor code, Labor Code 5412. Okay? So first of all, Labor Code 3600 is what allows the post-employment filing of a cumulative trauma injury claim, but there's a requirement, and that is that the requirement is that the date of the injury has to be after the notice of termination or layoff. So that opens up for close scrutiny and for dispute by the parties the date of injury under Labor Code 5412. So let's review Labor Code 5412 and discuss where it is that the potential objections and disputes can arise that bring these cases to us as qualified medical evaluators. So remember, Labor Code 5412 tells us that the date of injury, this is for cumulative trauma injuries, the date of injury is that date upon which the employee first suffered disability therefrom, and, in other words, this doesn't say or, it says and. So both of these criteria have to co-occur. It says and either knew, had the knowledge, that is, or in the exercise of reasonable diligence should have known that such disability was caused by his or her present or prior employment. Now, let's take a close look at this labor code, and let's ask ourselves, where in this labor code can the potential disputes arise? Okay? So let's take a look at it. It says it's that date. That date. So is date an issue that could be raised as a dispute? Could one party claim that the date is such and such a date, and another party claim that that's not the actual date, that it's actually a different date? Of course. Of course it can. And of course it does, especially when there's multiple insurers involved. One insurer is going to attempt to claim that the date of injury is when the other carrier was providing the coverage. And of course the other insurance carrier is going to say, no, the date of injury was when you were providing the coverage. Okay, so this is an area of great dispute. Let's continue. It says it's that date upon which the employee first suffered disability. So first is going to be an area of great contention, as one party says you suffered disability at a different time, and the other party says, no, I didn't suffer disability then. My first disability was at a different time. And this can be an area of great contention as well. Disability. Disability. What qualifies as disability? What qualifies as disability? Is disability the need for medical treatment? Is disability the first suffering of symptoms? Is disability when the employee first suffered their first wage loss? In other words, they went off work and suffered loss of wages. Is it when they suffered their first permanent disability? What qualifies as disability? This is an area of great dispute as well, and we're going to see that in the cases that we reviewed today. Okay, so this first half of Labor Code 5412 has to deal with disability, the date of disability. Okay, so that's criteria number one. Now the second half of this code deals with knowledge. It says, and either knew, so this is an area of great dispute. One party will say, well, you knew you were suffering disability from the workplace activities, and the other party can say, no, I didn't. Prove it. Prove that I knew it. I didn't know it. I didn't know it at the time. In fact, I didn't know it until much later. And then the other party is going to say, oh, baloney. You should have known. You should have known that the workplace duties were contributing to your disability. You should have known that. In other words, you should have reported this earlier because you should have known it. This is the phrase in this labor code that prevents delay in filing the claims. Because one party can contend that, hey, you should have known that much earlier, and you should have filed it back when you were in the employment period, or back when the coverage was being provided by insurer A versus insurer B. So this has to deal with the knowledge. The knowledge that the disability was caused by his or her present or prior employment. So as we review this simple code, which is simply one sentence, you can see that almost each and every word within this code raises the potential for dispute by the parties, and we're going to see that illustrated in these three cases that we review. So we're going to talk about disputes related to both the disability and what actually qualifies as disability. And we're going to see disputes that arise based on contentions about the knowledge component here. The knowledge component. And Labor Code 5412 tells us that the date of injury is when both of these coincide. When both of these independent factors, the disability and the knowledge of the disability being related to the workplace activities, coincide. And those can coincide at different dates. But they have to coincide to establish the date. So we're going to see how this plays out in 3 actual live cases. But first, let's talk a little bit about what the law has to say about what qualifies as the disability component of Labor Code 5412. Okay, so Labor Code 5412 tells us that the date of injury for cumulative trauma injury claim is that date upon which 2 things coincide. Number 1, the employee first suffered disability and knew that the disability was caused by the workplace duties, due to his or her present or prior employment. So let's talk about the disability. What actually qualifies as disability? And this is an area of great dispute and great contention among the parties. The applicant attorney will argue that my client suffered disability, and the defense attorney will argue that there was no disability present at all. So what qualifies, therefore, under law and under interpretation of case law, as the disability? Is disability the need for medical treatment? In other words, we have an employee who's suffering symptoms and who either goes to his primary care physician or requests medical treatment under the workers' compensation claim and obtains medical treatment. Does the obtaining or the need for medical treatment, does that qualify as disability? We shall see. What about work restrictions? Let's say the employee goes to the medical provider and the medical provider returns them back to work with some work restrictions, such as no lifting over 40 pounds, such as no repetitive motions of the upper extremities beyond 90 minutes. I'm making these up, but these are work restrictions that you may have come across in your work as a qualified medical evaluator. Does the presence of medically prescribed work restrictions qualify as disability? Would work restrictions help to establish the date of injury under Labor Code 5412? Are work restrictions sufficient to establish the disability under Labor Code 5412? What about orthopedic devices? We see this all the time. Imagine an employee who goes to the medical provider with complaints of lower back pain. And the medical provider returns the employee to full and unrestricted work duties, but with an orthopedic lumbar support device, or an ankle support device, or wrist splints for carpal tunnel syndrome, or fill in the blank, any orthopedic device. Does the requirement or the necessity of the use of an orthopedic device, would that constitute disability? And the date that that orthopedic device was prescribed, would that satisfy the date of injury under Labor Code 5412? Or does the term disability as used in Labor Code 5412, does that refer simply and solely to compensable disability? For example, does it solely apply to employees who have been taken off work on total temporary disability and who now are suffering actual wage loss? In other words, is wage loss required to establish disability under Labor Code 5412? It doesn't seem like it should, does it? It doesn't seem like it should. If temporary disability with wage loss is required to establish disability, what would that mean for the entire population of employees who continue to work with perhaps an injury, with perhaps a need for medical treatment with perhaps use of orthopedic devices, but who continue working up until the day that they resign, to the day that they retire. In other words, they never suffered wage loss. Are those employees excluded from disability, from establishing a disability, and from establishing a claim for cumulative trauma injury under Labor Code 5412? What about employees who suffered a permanent disability? Permanent disability. They worked all the way to their last day of work, and then they file a claim, and they're found to have permanent disability with diminished future earning capacity. This is a compensable disability, as is temporary disability. Are these required to establish disability under Labor Code 54? Or which of these factors could actually constitute a disability? And you're going to see in these cases, including the very next one that we discussed, that each of these is an area of great contention, great dispute, as one party contends that their client's particular presentation qualifies as disability. In other words, they're establishing an industrial injury by establishing the disability. And the defense attorney or the defendant or the opponent is claiming that there was no disability suffered at all. So we're going to see which combinations of these various factors constitute and qualify for disability to establish a date of injury under Labor Code 5412. So let's illustrate these principles with three actual cases. Okay, again, so under Labor Code 54012, the date of injury for a cumulative trauma injury is when two things coincide. First is when the employee first suffers disability, and then number two, when the employee first gains the knowledge that the disability is caused by the workplace activities. So in this case, the Wagner versus WCAB case, we're going to see that the dispute involves what qualifies as the disability. And when the employee first suffered disability is going to determine the date of injury. Now, can you see how this could be important? Especially in cases where, as in this case, the Wagner case, where the employer was insured by different insurers during different periods of time. So the contention is going to be that insurer A is responsible for the disability and the benefits, and the response from the opposite carrier is that no, you're responsible, and each party is going to contend that the date of injury occurred when the other insurer was providing the coverage. So with Wagner, the Workers' Compensation Appeals Board found that the applicant's date of injury with regards to her industrial cumulative trauma injury under Labor Code 5412 was the date she first suffered disability from her injuries and not just symptoms from her injuries. So what happened with Wagner is Wagner was involved with repetitious upper extremity motions at work, and in and around May, I think it was 1991, she woke up in the morning after one particularly heavy day of work the day before. She woke up in the morning with numb hands. And so she went to the emergency room for medical treatment, and she was suffering symptoms at this time in May 91. She went to the emergency department. The doctor in the emergency department informed her that her numb hands were due to the workplace activities the day before, and due to cumulative trauma even before that. So she gained the knowledge. Here in May 91. She had symptoms in May 91. She received medical treatment in May 91. But the Workers' Compensation Appeals Board was not required to find that the date of injury was when she first suffered symptoms. It was not when she knew that they were employment related. Not when she first knew, which is in May 91. And it was not when she first received treatment, which was also in May 91, because she did not suffer disability at that time. So in this particular case, the Wagner case, disability is not the first suffering of symptoms. It's not when the first knowledge occurred. It's not when she received first medical treatment. The Workers' Compensation Appeals Board determined and opined that none of these facts constituted disability, were not sufficient to establish disability under Labor Code 5412, were not sufficient to establish May 91 as the date of injury for this cumulative trauma injury. So that came as good news to the insurer providing coverage at this particular time, when she first developed the symptoms, when she first required medical treatment, when she first realized that the symptoms were due to the workplace duties. So then what was, in this case, what was sufficient to establish the disability, and what was sufficient to establish the date of injury? Okay, so let's take a look at some of the facts of this Wagner case and see how knowledge and disability coincide, or at least how the Workers' Compensation Appeals Board determined that those two coincided to establish the date of injury and therefore the liability for benefits allocated to one insurer compared to another insurer. So first of all, one of the insurers contended that the date of injury was in May of 1989. And the insurer contended that Ms. Wagner had knowledge and disability first in May of 1989. And the insurer established the knowledge by citing the facts that Ms. Wagner went to the emergency department in May of 89, and there she was told by the doctor that her problems were work-related. So this established one criteria to assert that she had knowledge as early as May 1989. Further, in May 1989, she reported the workers' compensation claim herself. And this reporting of the workers' compensation claim many times is what actually constitutes, or is the only thing that constitutes, evidence of the employee's knowledge that the disability is caused by the workplace duties. And she did. She reported the claim in May 1989, and she also reported the injury to her employer. So insurer A contended that these three pieces of data confirmed that indeed Ms. Wagner had knowledge as early as May 1989. Then the insurer went on to create a case that she suffered disability. Ms. Wagner suffered disability also as early as May 1989. And in support of that claim, insurer A pointed to the fact that according to Ms. Wagner's testimony, she had stopped lifting heavy items as early as May 1989 after she first went to the emergency department. She told her employer that she was not lifting heavy items. In other words, she had work restrictions, self-imposed work restrictions that insurer A pointed to when establishing the disability as early as 5/1/89. And then also she missed at least one day of work in May of 1989, and insurer A pointed to these facts in support of a disability, a first suffering of disability, as early as May of 1989. Now this is an insurer who wants to escape liability for this claim, and this insurer is pointing to a different time period, a different date of injury, when another insurer was providing coverage for this particular company. Well, In the end, the Workers' Compensation Appeals Board found that the date of injury was later in August, and this is a point in time when Ms. Wagner began formal medical treatment with a specialist. It was a hand specialist in this case. This was an upper extremity case. And she began formal treatment, active and ongoing treatment, with a specialist on April 26, 2091. And 1991, and the specialist returned Ms. Wagner to full work duty. In other words, she didn't suffer actual wage loss, but he provided braces for both of her wrists. And in this case, it was the braces, the provision of the braces on 8/26/91 that established the first disability. So in this particular case, the Court of Appeals decided that it was the braces, the need for orthopedic devices, not the first day of suffering of symptoms, not the day of first medical treatment, not the day of knowledge. In this case, the knowledge, unlike post-employment cumulative trauma claims where the knowledge comes after the disability, in this case, the knowledge came before the date of the disability. So it was the braces, the need for the orthopedic support device, that created the disability, that established the disability sufficient to qualify that date as the date of injury under Labor Code 5412. So this is important for us to recognize as qualified medical evaluators, that in this case, the medical treatment, the provision of braces, was a more aggressive approach to medical treatment than what she It was a more aggressive approach to treatment, to the medical treatment, than what she had received when she went to the emergency room several months earlier in May of 1991. And this is important for us as qualified medical evaluators to understand that changes in the medical treatment could be sufficient to establish the date of injury, especially when the change in the medical treatment involves a significant or much more aggressive form of medical treatment. And that's a principle that's going to be illustrated as well. In this case, the Wright versus the WCAB, and this again has to do with the dispute over the date of the disability to establish the date of injury under Labor Code 5412. Let's review some of the facts of this case. In May of 1995, Wright went to the doctor, and at the doctor's office, he was told by the doctor that his hip problems were work-related. So this is the date upon which Mr. Wright gained the knowledge that the symptoms that he was having were due to the workplace activities. So criteria A, knowledge, is established under Labor Code 5412. But what about disability? What about disability? When is the disability? When does the disability coincide with the knowledge? Well, as we're going to see, that was an area of dispute and contention among the parties. Well, the doctor recommended hip surgery. Hip surgery, a significant form of medical treatment, an aggressive form of medical treatment. Well, the surgery was deferred, and Mr. Wright continued to work without work restrictions, without modifications, without need for orthopedic devices, until he eventually did have the hip surgery on January 9th, 1997, approximately 18 months later, correct? Okay? So what happened in this case is that the judge found 2 cumulative trauma periods. What he found was that in the time period leading up to this first medical treatment visit on 5/95, that there was one period of cumulative trauma which established the date of injury of May 95, because May 95 was the date of the first need for medical treatment. Okay, so in this case, in contrast to the Wagner case, where the first medical treatment was not sufficient to establish the date of injury, in this case, the date of first medical treatment was sufficient to establish the date of injury under Labor Code 5412. The date of medical treatment was sufficient to establish the disability. So it was the need for medical treatment that established the disability, because the disability was not based on missed time from work, from lost wages, for the need for orthopedic devices, or any of the other criteria that we talked about. In this case, it was the date of first need for medical treatment. Well, after the first date of need for medical treatment, Mr. Wright continued to work. He continued to work full-time and in unrestricted work duties, during which, makes sense, he continued to suffer cumulative trauma, since he continued in this very same workplace duties. Well, the judge found a second period of cumulative trauma, 595 through 197, and 197 established the date of the second cumulative trauma injury, because that was the date of a new need for medical treatment. The medical treatment in this case involved hip surgery, an aggressive and significant form of medical treatment, and a significant change in the medical treatment. And again, it was not based on disability or missed time from work, because actually Mr. Wright had not suffered any lost wages or any lost time from work. He did not suffer work restrictions, but here the disability and the two cumulative trauma period dates of injury were established by the dates at which the medical treatment was either initiated or changed. Very interesting. And the judge cited Labor Code 3208.1, which we talked about 2 sessions ago, which relates to what constitutes a cumulative trauma injury. And 3208.1 says that a cumulative trauma injury results from repetitive physical trauma over a period of time, comma, the combined effect which causes any disability or need for medical treatment. So here the judge pointed to Labor Code 3208.1 in establishing 2 cumulative trauma injuries, because each one caused a need for medical treatment and different forms of medical treatment. The first medical treatment was conservative. The second medical treatment involved a surgical procedure. So this is important for us as qualified medical evaluators to recognize when our examinees have undergone either a change in medical treatment or a new form of medical treatment, especially when they're continuing unrestricted in their workplace duties and not suffering any compensable disability. They're not suffering temporary disability, and there's no evidence that they're yet permanently disabled, even before they receive their first medical treatment. So in this case, the petitioner filed for a writ of review. They contended that the need for medical treatment alone was not sufficient to establish a date of injury in a cumulative trauma case. The medical treatment alone was not sufficient to establish the disability under Labor Code 5412, but the court opined differently and the writ was denied. So in this case, the need for medical treatment was the sole criteria that constituted the disability which established the date of injury under Labor Code 5412. There was no other disability. There certainly was no compensable disability, and there was no wage loss, and there was no work restrictions. So in this case, the court relied upon the need for medical treatment, citing Labor Code 3208.1 as their authority in arriving at this particular opinion. So here we see 2 examples where medical treatment, or the need for medical treatment, establishes the disability under Labor Code 5412. This is important for us as qualified medical evaluators, because many of the examinees that we see are continuing or have continued in their unrestricted work duties up until a significant change in the medical treatment, such as in this case, or in the case of post-employment cumulative trauma claims, the employee continues unrestricted in their work duties up until the date of their termination or resignation. And it's not until later that they undergo a need for medical treatment, and that need for medical treatment can be sufficient to establish the disability and can establish the date of injury, and then can thus establish a compensable post-employment cumulative trauma claim. So in the Wagner and the Wright cases, it was the need for medical treatment that established the disability component of the date of injury under Labor Code 5412. And the last case that I want to share with you is the Rodarty case. And the Rodarty case has some aspects in common with both Wagner and Wright related to medical treatment, but takes a slightly different twist, at least according to the interpretation of the Workers' Compensation Appeals Board. So with Rodarty in 1097, again, Rodarty was an upper extremity repetitive cumulative trauma injury claim. And in 1997, Ms. Rodarty received her first medical care, which consisted of anti-inflammatory medications. And like Wagner, she was provided with a wrist splint. She was also provided with a short course of physical therapy treatment. She filed a claim at the same time. So she also returned to modified work duties. So these factors constitute a confirmation that as early as 1097, Ms. Rodarty had knowledge that the symptoms that she was having were due to her workplace duties. So one component of the criteria for the date of injury under Labor Code 5412 is established here as early as 1097, and that is the knowledge. Well, what about the disability? As we saw in the Wagner case, the provision of the wrist splints in the Wagner case was sufficient to establish the disability, right? Remember that from the Wagner case. Well, in this case, different from the Wagner case, Wagner returned to unrestricted work duties, where here Ms. Rodarty returned to modified work duties. So perhaps it's the modified work duties that contributes to the disability, or like Wagner, perhaps it's the wrist splint that contributes to the disability or constitutes the disability. Well, the WCAB found it different, as we're going to see. Now, after this, Ms. Rodarty continued working with modified duties until she was terminated. And the reason she was terminated was that new management discovered that she was working under modified work duties, and so the employer initiated a termination, a separation, because they determined that Ms. Rodarty was unable to perform the workplace duties for which she was originally hired, and on that basis, they terminated her. Well, after medical treatment, she was found permanent and stationary on 5/31/2000, more than 16 months after she was terminated. Okay, so with these basic facts that we know, what is the correct date of injury? Is it the date of injury, is it 1097 when it's fully established that she had knowledge? But is it established that she had disability as early as 1097? Does the wrist splint, does the modified work duties, do those constitute the disability under Labor Code 5412? Or should the date of injury more accurately be described as her last day of work, when she certainly had the knowledge? In fact, the knowledge was established back in 1097, but can disability be established as of the last day of work on August 9, 98? Well, As we learned earlier, according to the WCAB, there's some references in the interpretation of case law that disability, in order to constitute disability, okay, in contradiction to both the Wagner and the Wright cases, in contradiction to those two, in this case, the WCAB states that disability, that which is referred to disability in Labor Code 5412, means compensable disability. Now, Ms. Rodarty did not have any compensable temporary disability because she continued to work with no lost wage. Now, temporary disability, that is lost time from work, involves wage loss. Ms. Rodarty was not temporarily disabled either before she left work in August of '98, nor was she temporarily disabled until after she left employment on 8/9/98. So wherein lies her compensable disability? When is she determined to have disability sufficient to establish the date of injury under Labor Code 5412? When? Well, is it possible that there could be evidence that Ms. Rodarty was suffering from some form of permanent disability even before she was declared to be permanent and stationary on May 2000, some 16 months after her last date of employment with the company? Well, what was the conclusion of the WCAB in this difficult determination? So at issue with the Rodarty case, which came to the Workers' Compensation Appeals Board to resolve, was the date of injury. Now, there was two potential possible dates of injury. One was 1097, and the other was on the last date of employment, 8/9/98. Now, of relevance to us as qualified medical evaluators, and sometimes this is involved in the determinations that we have to make, is what is the actual date of injury? Well, on 8/9/98, there was an insurer in place different from the insurer in place on 1097. So, of course, the insurer in place on 8/9/98 contended that the date of injury was actually 1097, which would fall under the obligation of the other insurer. And insurer B stated that on 1097, when Ms. Rodarty first received medical treatment, when she was returned to modified work duties, when she was prescribed a splint for her wrist, these three facts established the disability sufficient to establish 1097 as the date of injury for this cumulative trauma injury, thereby exonerating themselves from liability, which would have been their sole responsibility if the date of injury was established to be 8/9/98. So you can see the significance of the correct determination as to the date of injury. All parties are going to be acutely interested and attuned to who's liable for the benefits. Well, the Workers' Compensation Appeals Board eventually opined on 8/9/98 as the date of injury, and they supported that determination by establishing that permanent disability also qualifies as a compensable disability sufficient to establish the date of injury. Now, typically we think of temporary disability, at least temporary total disability, which involves wage loss, to constitute the compensable disability that establishes the date of injury. But actual wage loss is actually required for temporary disability, temporary total disability. The WCAB told us that modified work alone, which is a partial disability, a temporary partial disability, TPD, right? We're comparing TPD here with TTD. TPD alone is not a sufficient basis to establish compensable temporary disability. because there's no actual wage loss with TPD. So Ms. Rodarty was returned to modified work duties and suffered no actual wage loss. However, on the flip side, and there's always a flip side, modified work may indicate a permanent impairment of earning capacity, especially if the worker is never able to return to the original work duties. And in this case, Ms. Rodarty continued to work modified duties until she was eventually terminated. So she never did return to the original work duties. So not being able to return to the original work duties, ongoing modified work, could be evidence of a compensable permanent disability. And what the WCAB determined in this case is that she became permanently impaired or permanently disabled on the date of her last employment. She was evidenced at that date, she was evidenced to have never been able to return to her normal original work duties, and this constituted the disability, the compensable disability. Permanent disability could constitute the compensable disability sufficient to establish the date of injury under Labor Code 5412. They further went on to say that medical treatment, like modified work, medical treatment alone is not disability. And this is in contradiction to what we found with Wagner and the Wright cases, where the need for medical treatment was sufficient to establish the disability. But in this case, the WCAB concluded that medical treatment alone is not disability, but it may be evidence of a compensable permanent disability, as may a need for splints, as may a need for modified work. So the conclusion of the WCAB is that these findings of medical treatment, of a need for modified work, of a need for splints, are all questions of fact to be resolved by the trier of fact in the determination as to whether or not these findings constitute the disability sufficient to establish the date of injury under Labor Code 5412. So on 8/9/98, it was determined that Ms. Rodarty suffered her first compensable disability in the form of a permanent disability because she was never able to return to her original work duties. So this left the liability for benefits on the insurer in place at the time of August 9, 1998, the date of her last work, her last day worked for this particular company. But the WCAB left it out for the insurance carrier by returning the case to the QME for a determination if permanent disability existed prior to the last date of employment, because up until this point in time, all the medical reporting indicated that this was the date that first began her compensable permanent disability, but it was still as yet unresolved as to whether or not it could be established that the compensable permanent disability existed prior to even her last day of employment with this particular company. So the WCAB here provided some hope for the insurer in place at this point in time that perhaps it could be demonstrated that compensable permanent disability existed even prior to this, in which case the liability for benefits would fall either wholly or partially on the employer in place at the time when she first gained the knowledge that her symptoms were due to the workplace duties. So doctors, I hope this helps you. This is a fascinating look at 3 actual cases where the disputes involved the date of injury for cumulative trauma claims, some of which were filed during the employment period, and this particular one wherein the disability extended into the post-employment period of time. even though the claim was filed while she was still involved in a relationship with the employer. So I hope this helps you when it comes time for you to make your determinations on the date of injury in a cumulative trauma injury claim. It's important that you take a look at what constitutes the disability. And herein we've seen cases where in medical treatment can establish the disability, work restrictions can establish the disability, the need for orthopedic support devices can establish the disability, a significant change in the medical treatment, particularly a movement towards more aggressive type of medical treatment such as surgery, can establish the disability, sufficient to establish a date of injury under Labor Code 5412. And each case has to be looked at a case-by-case basis. And that's why we as qualified medical evaluators earn the big bucks. Because the buck stops on our desk for these difficult determinations. So doctors, I hope this helps you get a big picture look at some of the cases that are crossing your desk even as we speak. You know, the work that we do as qualified medical evaluators is very, very difficult. But if we can step back and look at the big picture involved in these cases and see some of the sequences of events that lead to these cases coming to us for our opinions and conclusions, it makes it easier for us to provide the final opinions and conclusions that are actually accurate and upon which the parties can resolve the disputed issues. So I want to thank you for taking the time to join me on today's discussion. I look forward to being with you on future discussions as well. And as we continue in our ongoing series entitled Cumulative Trauma and the QME. For now, this is Dr. Perry Carpenter. I'm wishing you best of success in your career as a qualified medical evaluator.